Hello and welcome to Back to the Book. It's time to relax and enjoy some of the finest literature ever written in English. Welcome back to Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. We left Miss Mattie in a rather awkward position in our last reading, so if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. Friends in Need. It was an example to me, and I fancy it might be to many others, to see how immediately Miss Mattie set about the retrenchment which she knew to be right under her altered circumstances. While she went down to speak to Martha and break the intelligence to her, I stole out with my letter to the Aga Jenkins and went to the signor's lodgings to obtain the exact address. I bound the signora to secrecy, and indeed her military manners had a degree of shortness and reserve in them, which made her always say as little as possible, except when under the pressure of strong excitement. Moreover, which made my secret doubly sure, the signor was now so far recovered as to be looking forward to travelling and conjuring again, in the space of a few days, when he, his wife, and little Phoebe would leave Cranford. Indeed, I found him looking over a great black and red placard, in which the Signor Barone's accomplishments were set forth, and to which only the name of the town where he would next display them was wanting. He and his wife were so much absorbed in deciding where the red letters would come in with the most effect, it might have been the rubric for that matter, that it was some time before I could get my question asked privately, and not before I had given several decisions, the wisdom of which I questioned afterwards with equal sincerity as soon as the signor threw in his doubts and reasons on the important subject. At last I got the address, spelt by sound, and very queer it looked. I dropped it in the post on my way home, and then for a minute I stood looking at the wooden pane with the gaping slit which divided me from my letter, but a moment ago in my hand. It was gone from me, like life, never to be recalled. It would get tossed about on the sea, and stained with sea waves perhaps, and be carried among palm trees, and scented with all tropical fragrance. The little piece of paper, but an hour ago so familiar and commonplace, had set out on its race to the strange wild countries beyond the Ganges. But I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation. I hastened home, that Miss Mattie might not miss me. Martha opened the door to me, her face swollen with crying. As soon as she saw me, she burst out afresh, and taking hold of my arm she pulled me in and banged the door to, in order to ask me if indeed it was all true that Miss Mattie had been saying. "I'll never leave her. No, I won't. I told her so, and said I could not think how she could find it in her heart to give me warning. I could not have had the face to do it if I'd been her. I might have been just as good for nothing as Mrs. Fitzadam's Rosie, who struck for wages after living 7 years and a half in one place. I said I was not one to go and serve mammon at that rate, but I knew when I'd got a good missus if she didn't know when she got a good servant." "But Martha," said I, cutting in while she wiped her eyes. "Don't but Martha me," she replied to my deprecatory tone. "Listen to reason." "I will not listen to reason," she said, now in full possession of her voice, which had been rather choked by sobbing. "Reason always means that someone else has got to say. Now I think what I have got to say is good enough reason, but reason or not, I'll say it, and I'll stick to it. I've money in the savings bank, and I've a good stock of clothes, and I'm not going to leave Miss Mattie. No, not if she gives me warning every hour in the day." She put her arms akimbo, as much as to say she defied me, and indeed I could hardly tell how to begin to remonstrate with her, so much did I feel that Miss Mattie, in her increasing infirmity, needed the attendance of this kind and faithful woman. "Well," said I at last, "I'm thankful you begin with 'well.' If you'd ha' begun with 'but,' as you did afore, I'd not ha' listened to you. Now you may go on." "I know you would be a great loss to Miss Mattie, Martha." "I telled her so. A loss she'd never cease to be sorry for," broke in Martha triumphantly. "Still, she will have so little, so very little to live upon, that I don't see just now how she could find you food. She will even be pressed for her own. I tell you this, Martha, because I feel you are like a friend to dear Miss Mattie, but you know she might not like to have it spoken about." Apparently this was an even blacker view of the subject than Miss Mattie had presented to her, for Martha just sat down on the first chair that came to hand and cried out loud, We had been standing in the kitchen. At last she put her apron down, and looking me earnestly in the face, asked, "Was that the reason Miss Mattie wouldn't order a pudding today? She said she had no great fancy for sweet things, and you and she would just have a mutton chop. But I'll be up to her. Never you tell, but I'll make her a pudding, and a pudding she'll like too, and I'll pay for it myself, so mind you see she eats it. Many a one has been comforted in their sorrow by seeing a good dish come upon the table." I was rather glad that Martha's energy had taken the immediate and practical direction of pudding making, for it staved off the quarrelsome discussion as to whether she should or should not leave Miss Mattie's service. She began to tie on a clean apron, and otherwise prepare herself for going to the shop for the butter, eggs, and whatever else she might require. She would not use a scrap of the articles already in the house for her cookery, but went to an old teapot in which her private store of money was deposited, and took out what she wanted. I found Miss Mattie very quiet, and not a little sad, but by and by she tried to smile for my sake. It was settled that I was to write to my father, and ask him to come over and hold a consultation, and as soon as this letter was dispatched, we began to talk over future plans. Miss Mattie's idea was to take a single room, and retain as much of her furniture as would be necessary to fit this up, and sell the rest, and there to quietly exist upon what would remain after paying the rent. For my part, I was more ambitious and less contented. I thought of all the things by which a woman, past middle age, and with the education common to ladies 50 years ago, could earn or add to a living, without materially losing caste, but at length I put even this last clause on one side, and wondered what in the world Miss Mattie could do. Teaching was, of course, the first thing that suggested itself. If Miss Mattie could teach children anything, it would throw her among the little elves in whom her soul delighted. I ran over her accomplishments. Once upon a time I had heard her say she could play on the piano, but that was long, long ago. That faint shadow of musical acquirement had died out years ago. She had also once been able to trace out patterns very nicely for muslin embroidery, by dint of placing a piece of silver paper over the design to be copied, and holding both against the window pane, while she marked the scallop and eyelet holes. But that was her nearest approach to the accomplishment of drawing, and I did not think it would go very far. Then again, as to the branches of a solid English education, fancy work, and the use of the globes, such as the mistress of the ladies' seminary, to which all the tradespeople in Cranford sent their daughters, professed to teach, Miss Mattie's eyes were failing her, and I doubted if she could discover the number of threads in a worsted work pattern, or rightly appreciate the different shades required for Queen Adelaide's face in the loyal wool work now fashionable in Cranford. As for the use of globes, I had never been able to find out myself, so perhaps I was not a good judge of Miss Mattie's capability of instructing in this branch of education. But it struck me that equators and tropics and such mystical circles were very imaginary lines indeed to her, and that she looked upon the signs of the zodiac as so many remnants of the black arts. What she piqued herself upon, as arts in which she excelled, was making candle-lighters, or spills, as she preferred calling them, of coloured paper, cut so as to resemble feathers, and knitting garters in a variety of dainty stitches. I had once said, on receiving a present of an elaborate pair, that I should feel quite tempted to drop one of them in the street, in order to have it admired. But I found this little joke, and it was a very little one, was such a distress to her sense of propriety, and was taken with such anxious, earnest alarm, lest the temptation might some day prove too strong for me, that I quite regretted having ventured upon it. A present of these delicately wrought garters, a bunch of gay spills, or a set of cards on which sewing silk was wound in a mystical manner, were the well-known tokens of Miss Mattie's favour. But would anyone pay to have their children taught these arts? Or indeed would Miss Mattie sell, for filthy lucre, the knack and the skill with which she made trifles of value to those who loved her? I had to come down to reading, writing, and arithmetic, and in reading the chapter every morning, she always coughed before coming to long words. I doubted her power of getting through a genealogical chapter with any number of coughs. Writing she did well and delicately, but spelling, she seemed to think that the more out of the way this was, and the more trouble it cost her, the greater the compliment she paid to her correspondent, and the words that she would spell quite correctly in her letters to me became perfect enigmas when she wrote to my father. No, there was nothing she could teach to the rising generation of Cranford, unless they had been quick learners and ready imitators of her patience, her humility, her sweetness, her quiet contentment with all that she could not do. I pondered and pondered until dinner was announced by Martha, with a face all blubbered and swollen with crying. Miss Mattie had a few little peculiarities, which Martha was apt to regard as whims below her attention, and appeared to consider as childish fancies of which an old lady of 58 should try and cure herself. But today everything was attended to with the most careful regard. The bread was cut to the imaginary pattern of excellence that existed in Miss Mattie's mind, as being the way which her mother had preferred. The curtain was drawn so as to exclude the dead brick wall of a neighbour's stables, and yet left so as to show every tender leaf of the poplar which was bursting into spring beauty. Martha's tone to Miss Mattie was just such as that good, rough-spoken servant usually kept sacred for little children, and which I had never heard her use to any grown-up person. I had forgotten to tell Miss Mattie about the pudding, and I was afraid she might not do justice to it, for she evidently had very little appetite this day, so I seized the opportunity of letting her into the secret while Martha took away the meat. Miss Mattie's eyes filled with tears, and she could not speak, either to express surprise or delight, when Martha returned, bearing it aloft, made in the most wonderful representation of a lion couchant that ever was moulded. Martha's face gleamed with triumph as she set it down before Miss Mattie with an exultant "There!" Miss Mattie wanted to speak her thanks, but could not, so she took Martha's hand and shook it warmly, which set Martha off crying, and I myself could hardly keep at the necessary composure. Martha burst out of the room, and Miss Mattie had to clear her voice once or twice before she could speak. At last she said, "I should like to keep this pudding under a glass shade, my dear." And the notion of the lion couchant with his currant eyes being hoisted up to that place of honour on a mantelpiece tickled my hysterical fancy, and I began to laugh, which rather surprised Miss Mattie. "I am sure, dear, I have seen uglier things under a glass shade before now," said she. So had I, many a time and oft, and I accordingly composed my countenance, and now I could hardly keep from crying, and we both fell to upon the pudding, which was indeed excellent, only every morsel seemed to choke us, our hearts were so full. We had too much to think about to talk much that afternoon. It passed over very tranquilly, but when the tea-urn was brought in, a new thought came into my head. Why should not Miss Mattie sell tea? Be an agent to the East India Tea Company, which then existed. I could see no objections to this plan, while the advantages were many, always supposing that Miss Mattie could get over the degradation of condescending to anything like trade. Tea was neither greasy nor sticky, grease and stickiness being two of the qualities which Miss Mattie could not endure. No shop window would be required. A small genteel notification of her being licensed to sell tea would, it is true, be necessary, but I hoped that it could be placed where no one could see it. Neither was tea a heavy article, so as to tax Miss Mattie's fragile strength. The only thing against my plan was the buying and selling involved. Thank you for listening. Do join me next time to find out whether Miss Mattie's tea shop plan comes to anything at all. I look forward to seeing you then. Take care. Goodbye.